What if I told you that the confusion, frustration, and misunderstanding you experience in relationships isn't random? What if I told you that behind every emotional reaction, every sudden shift in behavior, every moment of silence or intensity, there's a predictable psychological pattern operating beneath the surface? Most men spend years trying to figure out women through trial and error. They make mistakes, lose connections, and walk away more confused than when they started. But the truth is this: female behavior is not as unpredictable as it seems. It follows psychological patterns. It follows emotional blind spots. And when you understand those patterns, everything changes. This is Liza from Secrets Inside the Mind, and today I am breaking down 7 psychological patterns, what many people call weaknesses, that every man needs to understand. Not to manipulate,
not to control, but to navigate relationships with clarity, emotional intelligence, and genuine understanding of how the female psychological system operates under pressure, uncertainty, and emotional investment. Engagement. CTA number 1, around 1 minute. If you've ever been confused by female behavior, if you've ever misread a reaction or completely missed what was really happening beneath the surface, subscribe right now. Because this video reveals the psychological truth behind patterns most men never understand. Keep watching until the end, because the final psychological pattern is the one that causes the most damage in relationships, and almost no one talks about it. Section 1, the psychology of emotional patterns. Why understanding matters. Before we get into the 7 psychological patterns, I need to establish something critical from a psychological standpoint. What we're discussing today are not flaws in character. They're not personal failures. They're natural psychological tendencies that exist in most human beings, but they appear with particular intensity in women due to how the female emotional system is wired. From a psychological perspective, women's emotional systems are designed with heightened sensitivity to relational dynamics. They're more attuned to shifts in connection, more responsive to emotional cues, and more likely to assign deep meaning to subtle behavioral changes. This is not weakness in the traditional sense. It's a psychological design. But when these tendencies operate unconsciously, when a woman doesn't have full awareness of her own patterns, they become blind spots. They create reactions that seem unpredictable from the outside, but are actually completely understandable when you know the psychology. Here's the Stoic perspective on this. Understanding human behavior is not about finding weaknesses to exploit. It's about maintaining your own emotional stability while navigating complex emotional dynamics. When you understand why someone reacts the way they do, you stop taking it personally. You stop reacting blindly. You start responding with intention and clarity. This is the psychological foundation for everything that follows. 7 blind spots, 7 patterns, 7 pieces of insight that will fundamentally change how you understand female behavior in relationships. Section 2, pattern number 1, emotional reactivity under pressure, when emotion overrides logic. The first psychological pattern is emotional reactivity under pressure. And this is where most men get lost because they interpret emotional reactions as final decisions rather than temporary emotional states. Here's the psychological reality. When situations become stressful, uncertain, or emotionally charged, the female emotional system tends to react before rational processing can intervene. This is not a character flaw. It's neuroscience. The emotional brain moves faster than the logical brain, and under pressure, emotion wins the race. From a psychological standpoint, this is known as an automatic response to emotional triggers. When emotions rise quickly, the brain prioritizes immediate emotional relief over long-term reasoning. This leads to impulsive communication, sudden declarations, or exaggerated responses that don't reflect her deeper actual intentions. Here's what most men miss critically. A woman may say something in a moment of frustration, fear, or insecurity, that she doesn't actually mean at a deeper level. But because it was said with emotional intensity, men interpret it as final and absolute. This creates a massive misunderstanding gap between what was felt in the moment and what was actually meant. The Stoic principle here is powerful. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space lies your power as a man. When she reacts emotionally, your job is not to match that emotional energy or take the reaction at face value. Your job is to maintain your emotional stability, give space for the reaction to pass, and respond to what's actually true rather than what was emotionally expressed. From a psychological standpoint, how you respond to her emotional reactivity determines the entire dynamic. If you react emotionally in return, you create escalation. Two emotional systems colliding with no rational foundation. If you remain grounded and stable, you become the psychological anchor of the interaction. And psychologically, women are deeply attracted to men who don't get swept up in emotional turbulence. The practical understanding here is, don't make permanent decisions or permanent interpretations based on her temporary emotional reactions. Give it time. Let the emotions settle. Then observe what remains. What remains after the emotion passes is the truth. Section 3, pattern number 2, fear of loss and attachment anxiety when security becomes urgent. The second psychological pattern is fear of loss and the attachment anxiety that comes with it. This is one of the most powerful psychological forces operating in female relational behavior. Here's the psychological mechanism. The female attachment system is designed to protect emotional bonds by increasing sensitivity to any perceived threat to the connection. When she senses distance, reduced attention, or potential change, her brain immediately goes into protective mode, trying to secure the connection before it's lost. This doesn't require an actual threat. It requires only the perception of one, a delayed response, a change in tone, reduced communication. These can all trigger attachment anxiety even when nothing has actually changed in the relationship. From a psychological standpoint, this explains so many behaviors that confuse men. The sudden neediness, the intense reaction to perceived distance, the urgency for reassurance and confirmation. These are not irrational behaviors. They're attachment system responses to perceived threats. Here's the Stoic insight. When fear of loss is active, she's not operating from rational clarity. She's operating from psychological urgency, a need to restore security before it disappears. And when people operate from urgency, their behavior often creates the very thing they fear. She pushes harder for connection. You feel pressure. You create distance. Her fear increases. It's a self-reinforcing cycle. As a man, understanding this gives you enormous psychological advantage, not to exploit it, but to navigate it wisely. When you recognize that her intense behavior is attachment anxiety rather than irrationality, you can respond with measured stability rather than reactive distance. You can give enough reassurance to reduce anxiety without sacrificing your own standards or position. Most importantly, you understand that creating deliberate distance is powerful precisely because of this pattern. When you walk away calmly, her attachment system activates. When you reduce availability, her mind begins to assess your value through the lens of potential loss. That's why absence affects female psychology so powerfully, not as manipulation, but as a natural consequence of how the attachment system works. Engagement. CTA number 2, around 8 minutes. If these psychological patterns are giving you new clarity, like this video right now, comment below and tell me which pattern resonates most with your experience. And if you haven't subscribed, subscribe now because the next patterns go even deeper. Section 4. Pattern number 3, overinterpretation of emotional signals. Reading too much into everything. The third psychological pattern is overinterpretation of emotional signals. And this is one that creates enormous confusion in relationships because it operates completely invisibly. Here's the psychological reality. The female mind is naturally pattern-seeking, especially in emotionally important connections. When emotional investment is present, her brain becomes hypersensitive to any variation in behavior. and immediately attempts to decode it as meaningful information. A delayed reply becomes evidence of reduced interest. A shorter message becomes a sign of emotional withdrawal. A change in tone becomes proof that something is wrong. None of these interpretations may be accurate, but from inside her emotional experience, they feel completely real and significant. From a psychological perspective, this is a form of cognitive distortion. Meaning is assigned too quickly, without sufficient evidence, and heavily influenced by her current emotional state. If she's feeling secure and confident, neutral signals are interpreted positively. If she's feeling anxious or uncertain, the same neutral signals are interpreted as negative. Here's the critical insight for men. Her behavior is often not responding to what you actually did or said. It's responding to what she interpreted what you did or said to mean. This distinction is enormous. You can do something completely neutral and trigger an intense emotional response simply because her interpretation engine assigned deep meaning to it. Understanding this pattern gives you two powerful insights. First, inconsistency in your behavior will be amplified in her interpretation. Small changes in your communication pattern will be noticed and analyzed intensely. This is why consistency is so psychologically powerful. It reduces the material available for overinterpretation. Second, when she reacts to something that seems minor to you, she's not being irrational. She's responding to a meaning she's constructed from signals you sent, even if that meaning was not your intention. Understanding this allows you to respond with clarity rather than dismissiveness. You address the interpretation, not the behavior. Section 5, Pattern. 4. Emotional dependence on validation. When external approval drives internal stability. The fourth psychological pattern is emotional dependence on validation. And this is one that most men accidentally exploit without understanding the consequences, or miss entirely and create unnecessary confusion. Here's the psychological mechanism. When a woman's sense of confidence, self-worth, and emotional stability becomes strongly influenced by external approval and attention, her internal state becomes reactive to your behavior. When you give attention and affirmation, she feels stable and secure. When that attention reduces or shifts, her emotional state destabilizes. From a psychological standpoint, this creates what's called a dependency loop. Her brain begins to associate your engagement with emotional safety. Your approval becomes a primary source of her emotional regulation. And when that source fluctuates, even slightly, her psychological system goes into search mode, looking for reassurance to restore stability. Here's where men make critical mistakes. They either give constant validation, which creates dependency and reduces their own value, or they withdraw completely, which creates anxiety without resolution. Neither extreme produces healthy dynamics. The Stoic principle here is clear. Internal validation is the foundation of genuine psychological stability. When self-worth comes from within, external reactions lose their power over emotional state. As a man, understanding this pattern helps you recognize that your attention is psychologically powerful, not just emotionally meaningful. When you give attention consistently and abundantly, you actually reduce your psychological influence because she no longer needs to work for it. When you maintain some natural selectivity with your attention, when it reflects genuine appreciation rather than constant availability, it retains its psychological weight. This is not about withholding affection cruelly. It's about understanding that validation has psychological value precisely because it's not infinitely available. When she knows your approval is genuine and not automatic, it means something. When your approval is constant and unconditional regardless of her behavior, it gradually loses its psychological impact. Section 6, Pattern number 5, Misreading silence and distance, the assumption machine. The fifth psychological pattern is misreading silence and emotional distance, and this is perhaps the most practically important pattern for men to understand because it directly influences how she responds when you walk away or create distance. Here's the psychological reality. Silence is neutral in itself, but psychologically, it is almost never experienced as neutral by women in emotionally invested relationships. The human brain is uncomfortable with uncertainty, and silence is the ultimate uncertainty, so her mind immediately fills that silence with meaning. From a psychological standpoint, this is the assumption machine activating. In the absence of information, her brain constructs explanations to reduce the discomfort of not knowing, and those explanations are heavily influenced by her current emotional state. If she's anxious, she assumes negative meaning. If she's confident, she might assume neutral meaning. But either way, silence becomes information, even though it isn't. Stoicism teaches something critically important here. Silence should first be observed as a lack of information, not immediately converted into meaning. But most women struggle to maintain this neutrality when emotional investment is present. The stronger the attachment, the more likely silence will be filled with emotional assumptions. Here's the practical psychological insight for men. Your silence is not neutral to her. Your distance is not just absence. It's a message her mind is interpreting. And this is exactly why walking away or creating space has such powerful psychological impact. You're not doing nothing. You're creating a vacuum that her psychological system is compelled to fill, usually with increased focus on you, your value, and what your absence means. Understanding this pattern also helps you avoid unnecessary misunderstandings. When she reacts intensely to your silence or brief unavailability. Section 7. Pattern, number 6, emotional memory, bias, how she remembers changes how she feels. Now, the 6th psychological pattern is emotional memory bias, and this one is subtle, fascinating, and critically important for understanding why female behavior can seem to shift without any new events occurring. Here's the psychological mechanism. Memory is not a fixed recording of events. It's a reconstructed process influenced by present feelings, expectations, and emotional context. This means that when her emotional state changes, her memory of past events changes with it. Not the facts, but the emotional weight and meaning assigned to them. When she's feeling secure and happy in the relationship, she tends to recall positive moments more vividly. The good times feel real and significant. When she's feeling anxious, uncertain, or distant, her memory shifts. Suddenly, the difficult moments feel more dominant. The positive moments feel less substantial. From a psychological standpoint, this explains something many men find deeply confusing. She can completely change her assessment of the relationship without any new events occurring. The relationship hasn't changed, but her emotional state has, and her memory is now filtering everything through that new emotional lens. Here's the Stoic insight. This is not conscious manipulation. It's not dishonesty. It's a natural cognitive process driven by the relationship between emotion and memory. When you understand this, you stop taking her shifting perceptions as definitive judgments. You recognize that her current emotional state is influencing how she remembers and interprets the past. This is also why emotional consistency from your side is psychologically powerful. When you maintain steady behavior, regardless of her emotional fluctuations, you give her memory system fewer opportunities to construct a distorted narrative. Consistency across time is the most reliable protection against emotional memory bias, both in her mind and in the actual record of the relationship. Engagement. CTA number 3, around 18 minutes. If this is shifting how you understand female behavior, comment below. Tell me which pattern has explained something you previously couldn't understand. Like this video and subscribe because the final pattern is the one that ties everything together. Section 8. Pattern number 7, difficulty with emotional boundaries, when her emotional world and yours merge. By Sondheim Pierce. The 7th and final psychological pattern is difficulty with emotional boundaries. And this is the one that causes the most long-term confusion, entanglement, and psychological drain in relationships. Yet, it's almost never discussed directly. Here's the psychological reality. Emotional boundaries refer to the ability to separate your internal emotional state from the feelings, reactions, and expectations of another person. When this boundary is weak, emotional experiences become deeply interconnected, meaning her mood, behavior, and emotional reactions directly influence your psychological state, and vice versa. From a psychological standpoint, women tend to have more permeable emotional boundaries by nature because the female brain is wired for deep emotional attunement and responsiveness to relational cues. This creates extraordinary capacity for empathy, connection, and emotional depth. But it also means that without clear boundaries, her emotional world can easily absorb external emotional influences. What this looks like practically: she takes on emotional responsibility for your mood. If you're distant, she feels she must have done something wrong. If you're unhappy, she feels compelled to fix it. If there's emotional tension, she experiences it as shared responsibility even when it isn't. Her emotional stability becomes partially dependent on your emotional state. Here's where this becomes important for men to understand. When her emotional boundaries are weak, your emotional state carries enormous psychological weight. Your moods affect her directly. Your stability provides her stability. Your instability creates her instability. Stoicism has a powerful principle here. You cannot control external situations, but you can control your internal state. As a man, your emotional consistency and groundedness is not just personally beneficial, it's relationally foundational when this pattern is present. Your calm becomes her psychological anchor. Your chaos becomes her psychological disruption. This also explains why women are so affected by men who are emotionally stable and unshakable. It's not just attractive, it's psychologically regulating. Her emotional system settles when it's in proximity to a man who maintains clear internal boundaries and consistent emotional control. The final critical insight is this. Understanding weak emotional boundaries helps you recognize when she's taking on emotional weight that isn't hers to carry, or when she's allowing your state to completely override her own. This isn't something to exploit, it's something to respect by being the kind of man whose emotional presence creates stability rather than chaos. Section 9. The Stoic Synthesis. What to do with this understanding. Now that you understand all 7 psychological patterns, the critical question is, what do you do with this knowledge? From a Stoic perspective, the answer is clear. Understanding is not a weapon, it's a tool for clarity. When you understand why someone behaves the way they do, you respond from awareness rather than reaction. You stop misinterpreting emotional reactivity as personal attack. You stop taking attachment anxiety as irrationality. You stop being confused by overinterpretation. You stop feeding validation dependence. You stop misreading her response to your silence. You stop being thrown by her shifting emotional memory. And you stop getting entangled in emotional boundary confusion. What you start doing is responding with intention, stability, and psychological understanding that makes you genuinely rare. Because most men don't understand these patterns.
Most men react to surface behavior without comprehending the psychological system beneath it. When you understand the system, you become the most emotionally intelligent man in any room. Not because you're manipulating, but because you're seeing clearly what others can't see at all. And from a psychological standpoint, that clarity makes you profoundly attractive. Because what women are ultimately drawn to, beneath all the patterns, all the reactions, all the complexity, is a man who sees them clearly, remains stable in the face of emotional intensity, and doesn't lose himself in her psychological storms. That's the ultimate Stoic insight. Master your own perception, and you master the dynamic. If this video fundamentally changed how you understand female psychology, comment below. Tell me which of the 7 patterns explains something in your own life that previously made no sense.
Tell me what you're going to do differently now that you understand these dynamics. Like this video if it gave you genuine clarity. Share it with someone who needs to stop reacting and start understanding. And subscribe to Secrets Inside the Mind, because this is exactly the kind of psychological depth that separates men who navigate relationships with clarity and confidence from men who stay confused, frustrated, and emotionally reactive their entire lives. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.